Hey folks, welcome to the Human Project podcast. We're really excited about this. Mark did something outside of his normal mode of operating. And Mark is a routine person, so when I noticed it, I wanted to ask him about it. And it led to a really good discussion of us talking about the power of story, the power of narrative. And really it got a lot deeper than we even expected of talking about our place in God's story. So hope you enjoy the podcast. Listen and let us know what you think. You shared something on Facebook that you had posted like 10 years ago or something like that, which is always fun to look back at like our past Facebook selves.
It's a little creepy. I mean, first of all, Facebook's like, hey, I remembered something about you you didn't remember. Like,
right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're like, oh. And not all memories are welcomed either.
Not exactly.
There's definitely some times when Facebook was like, so-and-so is thinking, and then the rest of the memory was like something or some song lyrics or whatever. At least that's the way it is for me.
I know what he's talking about.
By the time people watch this, Facebook won't even be a thing anymore.
Like, what was Facebook?
Now we're on the TikToks. But anyways, you had shared a quote that you put, and it struck me as something different than what I would normally see from you on Facebook. And it was a C.S. Lewis quote.
Yeah. And
it was about wanting to live or be in or read fairy tales.
Yeah.
And it struck me because I'm like, reading. I recommend so many books to this guy. It's crazy.
I read stuff.
He sends me lots of articles. I send him lots of books. I think he gets the better end of this bargain because I just give him homework. But it struck me because you mentioned something about reading and then fairy tales. So why was that impactful for you then, and why did you decide to share it again?
It's so interesting you pulled the word reading out of it because I didn't even remember that the word reading was in it.
Okay.
Really. To me, it was about fairy tales. First of all, it's hard to find a short C.S. Lewis quote.
That's very true.
I'm like, oh my gosh, a short C.S. Lewis quote. So that was the only reason. No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there was something unexpected about the quote, which is lovely, absolutely enjoyable and delightful to say, like, I didn't expect that to go that way. And I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it was something along the lines of, I hope I live long enough to be old enough to enjoy fairy tales again. To me, it was speaking of like, as a kid, of course, fairy tales, right? You get swept away in the story and imagination, and that's important, and it's all encompassing as a child. At least it was to me, right? I just go wherever the story is going.
Pretend
awesome.
play.
Yeah. Oh, yep. Exactly. Mm-hmm. But then, I don't know about you, but for me, the older I got, the more it was like the rational part was more important. And there's some natural part to that and some very sad part of that. To me, there's a natural part of that of growing up. And of course, we leave behind the childish things.
Yeah.
But there's some essence of that I'm seeing the older I get, the more I appreciate the imagination, the story, because I think that's how God made us.
Yeah.
There's something deep about that.
Yeah.
If you will say fairy tale or myth or any of those types of things when we're talking about story elements that I think are written into us as humans, because it's how God operates too, right? Look at what is so much of the Bible? It's stories, story form of how things are told. And that's a very Eastern approach, very Middle Eastern approach, is to tell things, an ancient approach really, is to tell things in stories. And nothing that God does is by accident. So why did he choose that people in those time frames telling stories? There's something deep about that. And so I just like, I want to recapture some of that and see some of those story elements of how God's operating and be willing to walk into those things and not just the rational side. Like I'm viewing it more holistically. There's something that's been lost for me, and I think for a lot of people.
So you had it as a kid, thinking in terms of fairy tales, stories, imagination, all of that. And then over time, it's been more towards the rational side, and you feel like you've over-indexed towards that.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And just like emotions, in some ways, it's similar to that we I think in general tend to diminish that in our culture. Likewise, story. Though story has a place, it's just set off to the side in the Marvel movies or Star Wars, right? But we love those things for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah, there's I get what you're saying. I started reading fiction again. For a long time, I only read nonfiction, as you well know.
Lots of it.
Yes, guilty. But I was drawn back into fiction for exactly the same reason. Is like my brain was getting very much in this rational spot, and I wasn't allowing myself to dream, to be creative, to just imagine things. And some of the best, like I've been reading Star Wars fiction books, and then one of our friends turned me on to, or gave me a recommendation for a book called Red Rising. And that was super cool because it's a very in-depth story that ties back to a lot of, I think, what you're talking about, how we are created to be as human beings. Like talking about things like freedom and like equality among humans and all of that, that it just are the overarching themes played out in a narrative story format. So I'm curious, why lately did that pick back up to you? Because you didn't share it last year when the memory came up, or 2 years ago.
Yeah, I probably wasn't on Facebook that day.
No.
I'm rarely on Facebook.
Yeah, I don't
just
really
happen
check
to be on Facebook
memories
this past week since my son's graduating from high school. So yay! I think there's something like music, which is something that is more stuff that I have held on to. But just like music, story, narrative, I think, brings things up that you can't just logic through. That it's like a different language almost, right? That I can learn things or understand things, or have, things can be revealed through story and through music that I can't put into as I say jokingly, it's not a math problem, right? You can't logic your way through some of those things to find that. The really deep, impactful things for me are when I'm realizing something through story or through music or through an experience as opposed to just logic. Not that there's not logic involved, but there's something really deep in that. And so I guess it's more like I'm recognizing some of the things that are lost, and yet some of the ways that it hasn't been lost. And it's been very powerful for me. And I didn't realize that's actually, story. That's part of how God made me. Anyway. So with Red Rising, I'm curious for you on that or any of the other stories you're back into. Like, was that your experience? Did it reveal things to you that, or help you see things in a different way than you would have if it was just, hey, I just asked you a closed-ended question. That's a tremendous coach job I just did for all of you watching at home.
Yes.
Okay, next question.
I think your deeper question is what does that look like, or what did that look like for me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well reworded.
It's like we've worked together a bunch
Something
and
like
spent a lot of time together or something. I had not thought of it that way, but I think if you were to say the statement of like, as human beings, we all go through a journey, or as human beings, we all have virtues, principles, things like that that are innate to us and we were created for. Like, yeah, I would agree with those and consent to them in my head.
Yeah.
But seeing it played out, like, there are times reading that book that I just get chills because it's so real.
Okay.
And you're like, oh wow, this is like experiencing it. Because I get really into books. Like,
no kidding. Wow.
Victoria and I, my wife, have been reading through it together because I had read it before, and I like to reread books.
Okay.
So we're reading through it together because the next book in the series is coming out in July, which, yes, that's how much of a nerd I am, is I'm looking forward to the next book release, not like going to the movies or something.
I got nothing.
But yeah, even reading it out loud, not just reading it like you would normally read a book. I don't know why I need to demonstrate.
In your head?
Yeah, like just hearing the words, but like saying the words and like doing a little bit of acting, do some voices, reading the book out loud.
Wow, we need to read books out loud together then in that case. That sounds really interesting.
Victoria's like, these three voices sound the exact same. I'm like, darn.
Yeah, when we read business books together, you don't use voices. I'm a little disappointed.
They have jobs. My face is probably getting red now. But yeah, it just becomes more experiential looking at it from that lens.
Mhm.
And I love like tying back to childhood. Like there was a time that we were super uninhibited with the world around us and we could just make things up wherever. I'm starting to see it with my daughter. Like she'll just have conversations with her toy stuffed animal fox and can't understand a word of what she's saying. But it's cool to see. And it's like, there are pieces of me that miss that. So I think, I was just curious what came up with that for you. So
yeah.
Thanks for diving into that.
Part of the innocence lost too is something that comes to mind for me in the midst of that. But I mean, look at the story arc of Scripture, which is really the story arc of history too, right? I mean, and when I say that it's written into us as humans, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
That there is creation, that there is a fall, that there is redemption, that there is, again, even deeper redemption and further redemption coming. There's a humongous story arc there with a bunch of other story arcs in it. And I think that's how God chooses to reveal himself is through story so often. And then we get to decide what part we are in it, how we want to look at it, which I think is a neat part looking back at kids too, because as a kid, you're in it, you're writing it, you're starring in it, you're directing it, whatever, you're the everything's in it. And perhaps as an adult, a shift for me is that for a life story, if you will, within the larger story, I do have some part that's kind of like an improv actor in a way, right? There's something in between there where God's the author and the director, if we want to put it in that analogy. And I'm playing a part that's important, or he wouldn't have put me in it. He made me for it. And yet I'm also not the play, right? It's not a one-man show. So there's some aspect of that to me that it calls to that's even deeper of like my part in it, so that I have a home and I'm not the everything. Like I'm not nothing, valueless, but I'm also not God.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay.
He asked a simple question. This is why we're having this conversation, I think.
I love stories, and I guess I had never seen it from that perspective. Like, I know it, but just made a connection of like cool things happening. Yeah. This is actually one of the things we're really hoping is that as we're diving into these, that we'll find things that like connect to things that we care about, two things that we care about that we can find intersections with. So
like
hopefully
we see this true in business environment too, right?
Oh yeah.
When you talk about a product and you see a team that is unmotivated to work on the product together, one of the first things we do is, well, why product? Like what is the deal with the product? What are your users using it for? What's the value? And the teams that really get it, that are all in on it, actually have a story.
Yeah. How
their users get benefit from it. And they will tell you a very compelling story because they've been told a very compelling story. And the teams that don't have no story to it whatsoever, they're like, we're upgrading the system because otherwise it costs too much. You're like,
yeah, really?
Right.
Yawn.
I'm surprised none of you are motivated by this.
Right. So what you got me thinking about was talking about the part to play is it reminds me of a quote. Take a guess where I'm going to pull this quote from.
The Office?
No, surprisingly. A serious place to pull a quote
He's
from.
watched every episode of The Office how many times?
Oh, geez. I have no idea. Way too many times.
Anyway, quotes from it constantly. So
yeah, I'm actually not wearing any Office memorabilia right now.
Shockingly.
Surprising.
So it was a pretty high percentage likelihood that it was from my Office. But anyway, Bible?
Not the Bible.
Wow.
That'd be a good one to pull from. But Tim Keller.
That was my third choice.
I figured it would be. So I've been rereading a book that was really impactful for me in my life, which was, theme here, rereading books. Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And one of the things that he talks about in the book, which helped really to elevate my understanding of like, what is my place in the world? Because it's really easy for us to be the center of our own stories. And realizing that we're often, we're not. Straight up, we're not. And God's big design. God is the center of the story and what he has done. And you talk about the story arc there. But getting to play a part. Like, I love that connection, because a quote that was really real for me was, God gives us exactly what we would have asked for if we know everything he knows. And I thought that was super cool, because it's really easy for us. Like, I think back in times of my life that have been the worst times of my life, and they ended up being the best. And I got to see some of those things work out. I'm in the midst of one right now where it's very confusing, scary, turbulent, and getting to see, like, what's my place in the story. Asking that is a huge reframe. Instead of just thinking about, like, why should the star of the story or the star of the show have difficulties come out? Like, unless you get to see, like, the hero's journey, which is typical story format. But, like, we're not in a Pixar story. We're not in a Pixar movie.
Because otherwise you'd be going, that's not how this works.
Right, yeah.
The hero comes through in the end.
Yeah. And I think the switch is really helpful to think about it from, like, what is the fairy tale? What is the story being played?
I have a quote for you. Guess where this is from?
John Eldridge. Yeah.
In his book Sacred Romance, actually it's a co-author of the book with a really good friend of his who passed away, right? And the turn for him, the reframe for him, the way he put that was he shifted from exactly what you're talking about to, God, what are you up to in this? That question to me is, I hear that like you're talking about, because it's assuming I'm not the center of it, and that God is doing something. Like, I trust his heart enough that even though I have no idea what it is, I can't see it, I would not have chosen this, this doesn't look like what God would want, or whatever the situation might be. Okay, if I have enough faith to at least ask, what are you doing here? Where are you going with this? What are you up to with this? That assumes that there is some, if you will, like, story arc in the language you've been using, some story arc that I don't see right now. That I can trust in his hand and his story arc in that.
Yeah. A curiosity question founded in trust. Yeah. Cool. Thank you for diving into that.
Yeah, thanks for asking and noticing my Facebook post.
Yeah.
Well, like the first time I posted in a year, probably.
It really is, unless it's like a promo for EMI or an upcoming class or something like that. That's why I was so surprised by it. I'm like, okay, there's something under the surface here for Mark that I haven't heard or talked about from him. So you got to see all of this on camera. Thanks for bearing your soul and ideas and connections and all that. So,
excellent conversation.
Yeah. Stories. Woo!
Stories for the win.
Fairy tales.
Awesome.
Thanks again for tuning in to today's episode of the Human Project podcast. Our team is made up of myself, Chris Conlin, Mark Wavle, and our lead editor, Derek Donley. We're a crowd-funded nonprofit. Most of what we do is free because of your generous support. If you want to learn more, check us out at humanproject.us. Thanks for partnering with us. Looking forward to talking in the next episode.